Everybody, it is a pleasure with all of you. I can't tell you how proud I am to be part of this group today. Years ago, JCPA held a session at our conference entitled "When Hate Goes Mainstream." I was one of the people in that room horrified, listening to a former FBI agent who led the Matthew Shepard Foundation and Amy Spitalnick discuss the rising incidents of hate and white supremacy plaguing our nation. As we just heard in our first plenary session today, the epidemic has only increased in the last 2 years. We heard moments ago that racism is a public health threat. In 2020 and 2021, we are only too well aware of how public health affects our lives every single day. I'm pleased to introduce our most talented panel today, and I'm going to start with Amy, who is Amy Spitalnick, the CEO of IFA, whose presentation 2 years ago so impacted my own efforts to stem hate over the last 2 years. Amy joined IFA with extensive experience in government, politics, and advocacy. She previously served as the communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York State Attorney General, communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and communications director in the New York State Senate. She's worked on a variety of local, state, and federal advocacy organizations. Amy frequently appears in national media and has been awarded a number of fellowships and honors, and she is really tremendous. A rising star under 40, and a fellow at the 92nd Street Y and a Truman's National Security Project fellow. She's amazing, and she will be terrific. And one of her partners in all of this along this incredible journey is Oren Segal. I'm excited to hear from Oren Segal from the Anti-Defamation League. He is vice president of the Center on Extremism. Oren and his team combat extremism, terrorism, and all forms of hate in the real world and online. We all know what ADL does for all of us every single day. He's recognized as one of the foremost authorities on this, and the center provides resources, expertise, and training, which enables law enforcement, public officials, and internet and technology companies to identify and counter emerging threats. Those threats are out there. Since Oren joined ADL in 1998, he has gained so much more experience after working for the New York Times and the Jewish Community Federation in San Francisco. For much of his 21 years with ADL, he's been devoting it to evaluating the activity and tactics of extremist groups and movements from across the ideological spectrum, training law enforcement officers and publishing reports and articles on a wide range of extremist topics. In 2006, Oren was recognized by the FBI for his exceptional service in the public interest. He was named to the Forward's list of 50 influential, intriguing, and inspiring American Jews in 2019. And finally, we're joined as well by Jamal Watkins, a longtime leader and senior vice president of strategy and advancement at the NAACP. We just heard from his colleague, and we know that Jamal, working with him will make a difference in all of our lives and is really at the forefront of the activity this year. Jamal previously led the association's efforts to maximize the African American community's participation and representation in our democracy as the vice president of civic engagement at the NAACP. Mr. Watkins previously served as National Outreach Director for the AFL-CIO, and in this role, he was responsible for strengthening and growing national strategic partnerships with the labor movement across a variety of priority campaigns. He's had a variety of jobs and experiences, and he's worked in several distinct arenas, including politics, campaigns, communications, education, human resources, and fundraising, and has played key roles across our nation. So we are so fortunate to hear from all of them today, from all of these terrific leaders. And we're going to asking each of the panelists to take a few minutes to give us your broad reflections on how we got from Charlottesville to the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. What are the patterns and the playbooks we've seen from these extremists? And thank you.
Thanks so much, Susie, and to everyone for being here, and always a pleasure to be with my colleagues from the ADL and the NAACP. And I'm really grateful for folks who are taking time out of this incredible conference to focus on this specific, crucial issue. I think it's impossible not to see the ways in which Charlottesville, in so many ways, previewed the cycle of violence that followed, including and especially the attack at the Capitol just a few months ago. We know increasingly, as we read more and more that's coming out of the indictments from DOJ and the other information about how the Capitol attack came together, that the insurrection has so closely followed so much of the Charlottesville playbook in terms of the tools, the tactics they used, and of course the broad strokes of the ideology at play, even though there are certainly major distinctions, and I know the ADL has done incredibly important research on this that I'm sure Oren will speak to. We know that at the core of so much of the white supremacist violence over the last 4 to 5 years has been this vile, violent white supremacy and this idea of the white race effectively being replacement theory, which is something I'm sure many have particularly paid attention to in the last few weeks as folks like Tucker Carlson increasingly mainstream these conspiracies on primetime TV. And it's this simple idea that the white race is, of course, being replaced, oftentimes with Jews as the puppet masters, and Black, brown, refugee, immigrant, and other populations being responsible for what they believe is a white genocide. And that's what these extremists meant in Charlottesville when they chanted, "Jews will not replace us." There was an important study that just came out of the University of Chicago the other week that affirms this ideology was so central to what so many of the Capitol insurrectionists believed and places where they came from. And we know that, of course, it has fueled the broader cycle of violence between Charlottesville and the Capitol, including Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso, and so much more. And so I think it's important to understand the ways in which Charlottesville really ended up being a preview or a harbinger of the cycle of violence that followed, including and especially as it relates to this ideology that continues to evolve and grow and seize on the moment that we're in to further this violent extremism.
Thanks. Oren?
Okay, thank you. And it's a pleasure. Do you hear me, by the way, okay, everybody? It's a pleasure to be on this panel with both Jamal and Amy, and thank you for having me. So how did we get from Charlottesville to the insurrection? I would say that there are similarities and there are differences. The similarities are the efforts to undermine democratic institutions under the guise of patriotism. And I think in Charlottesville, we saw that through a very sort of clear lens of white supremacy, white supremacist groups who were trying to suggest that somehow their view of what America was the real America, was the white America. The irony of Nazi symbols sort of notwithstanding, I think that was a fundamental effort to undermine our democratic institutions. And so was January 6th, although not necessarily primarily through a lens of white supremacy. But the way that the organization happened, the way that people tried to win hearts and minds, the blueprint, if you will, that we saw leading up to Charlottesville, the normalization of xenophobia, misogyny, anti-immigrant sentiment, other forms of hatred, made Charlottesville more sort of acceptable and almost predictable in a sense, because that was coming off of a presidential election that was marked by such divisiveness and hatred. And in the lead up to January 6th, there was similar, these clues, whether it was people who stormed capitals in other parts of the country in the summer, whether, again, it was the normalization of conspiracy theories like stolen elections. These also animated people to action in the same way that other narratives animated those in Charlottesville. So the blueprint in many ways was the same. I would say probably the insurrection was a little bit more in plain sight. But here's the major difference that I think at some point in this conversation I know we'll get to, and I'll conclude with this, is that we have to remember that of the 800 or so people that actually got into the Capitol, I think over 400 have been charged now, but we know that there's more. But of those numbers, about 25% are linked to either white supremacists or more commonly anti-government groups, conspiratorial groups, which means 75% are not. And so I'd say the big jump between Charlottesville and what we saw in the insurrection is a more mainstreaming and normalization of the narratives and ideas that brought us to both of those places.
Jamal?
Thank you, Susan, and likewise, it's good to be with Oren and Amy and in this space. I bring you greetings on behalf of the NAACP and our president and CEO, Derek Johnson, and our members around the country. When we think about the notion of Charlottesville to now, I would actually take us back to what we believe is a cycle that started, at least in an amplified way, with the election of President Barack Obama in 2008. So you see people of color and progressives being able to win at the highest level and elect virtually a man of color to run the country. A couple of years later, you see the Tea Party being whipped up, sort of an extreme arm of the Republican Party at the time that was really, in a response to that. And of course, you saw in 2011 voter suppression bills everywhere. Again, this response to this fact that, wait a minute, if we're losing elections and the we would be this notion of white supremacy, then we have to do something to counter it. 2016 happens and you see a victory by a leader-in-chief who was willing to use extremists, to use racism, to use xenophobia to win. And so again, you're willing to take the party apparatus and go even more extreme. So almost Trumpism really going even further than what you saw with the Tea Party. All of that backdrop then triggers in what we saw was what happened in Charlottesville in some ways, of this notion that there's a group of people reclaiming their country, if you will, and really standing up for themselves and asserting their rights, even though it's irrational and actually rooted in racism. And then when you jump to the election of 2020, there's a loss. So at that point, the momentum of winning, the momentum of reclaiming the country for its rightful heirs is somehow at jeopardy. And the ruling class, and this is where it's really troubling, those that are wealthy, who don't purport to be racist, who say, I'm not with, xenophobia, but are willing to use that arm of the country to stay in power, I think inflamed individuals to go to the Capitol and do what happened in January 6th. And so what we see is this hybrid of racism and xenophobia that's always been there, but being used by, I would consider, the wealthy elite and conservatives, and even the far right, if you will. They got in bed with each other and figured this is how we're going to reclaim. Is a deadly cocktail. And it's a cocktail that actually should never be mixed. And we've seen this happen in other sectors, which I'll unpack, as we get into the Q&A. But I believe, and we believe, that the trends of this is about race, class, and power, and really leveraging those things to stoke racism and xenophobia in a way that keeps us divided so that someone in particular, or some group, can stay in power.
Okay, Oren, talk about the statistics and what your findings have been that Jamal just made. How's the right-wing extremist movement grown and evolved over the last 4 years? How do you see it?
Sure, and I think we also. You can hear me now? Great. I think we need to remember how we're also defining right-wing extremists. And so I think many times we think of white supremacy, who sort of certainly fit neatly into that description. We're also talking about anti-government extremist groups. We're talking about conspiracy theories. We're talking about people who are animated by disinformation and narratives that are steeped in ancient hatreds, whether they are intentionally sort of modernized or toned down to appeal to wider audiences. We've seen a lot of different characters, a lot of ideas come together that form this right-wing extremist movement. But when you're asking about data, we also have some data that I think is important so that people understand why right-wing extremism is so important to talk about. It's not just important because of an insurrection. It wasn't just important because of what we saw in Charlottesville. It was important to understand and measure and respond even without those incidents ever happening. And so one data point that I think is very important is we track extremist-related murders in the United States every year. We put out an annual report. And when you look at the past 10 years, 75% approximately of extremist-related murders have been carried out by right-wing extremists. So that didn't start 4 years ago or 5 years ago, right? This is over a period of time. Anti-government and white supremacists have been responsible for the majority of extremist-related murders in this country for years. And yet, I think we were a little blind to that in this country. We focused on legitimate threats of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We can't deny, we don't have a luxury to ignore any extremist threat. But we dropped the ball. And the data showed us, and now I think people are paying attention to the threats that we're seeing, right? And you can no longer ignore. And I'm going to give another data point, which is the idea of how do white supremacists feel like they can reach, recruit, and radicalize people. Like one measure of whether they're comfortable to try to get new adherents is through propaganda, right? And so we identify when propaganda is shared on the ground, not online, which is a whole other discussion and frankly a whole other session. But what do the numbers tell us? And we saw over 5,000 examples of white supremacist propaganda being put on religious institutions, government buildings, college campuses, the public square, if you will, for efforts to not only create fear and anxiety in those communities, but also as a way to try to attract people to this cause. That was almost double the amount we saw the previous year, and we were in the middle of a pandemic. And so this is one important data point that shows people's willingness to bring it to the street, is another reason why we continue to be concerned about the growth of these broader movements.
Wow. Amy, do you have anything to add? I know I've heard you speak about helping us connecting the dots, how we've seen how certain things certain incidents have affected different communities targeted by these folks. And most recently, we've seen it in the Asian American community. Listening to you all, it's clear that these aren't isolated incidents. There's a larger pattern here. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. While Charlottesville was a flashpoint, and so many of these other attacks since have certainly been flashpoints, they are not isolated incidents. They're part of this much larger cycle of extremist violence in which each attack so often is used to inspire the next one. So, for example, we can really draw a line from the defendants in our Charlottesville lawsuit through a number of the other white supremacist and extremist attacks over the last 4 years. We know that the Pittsburgh shooter who killed 11 Jews praying in synagogue on Shabbat communicated with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack. We know that the Christchurch shooter who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque in New Zealand 2 years ago both donated to two of our Charlottesville defendants, Richard Spencer and Andrew Anglin, and painted onto his gun a white power symbol that was popularized by a third, Matthew Heimbach. Christchurch was live streamed on Facebook, and in turn seemingly inspired the Poway Chabad attack, the El Paso attack, and on this cycle goes, in which each attack is really used to inspire the next one. And so often we refer to these attackers as lone wolves, but I think that's a misleading term. These are people who are operating often on social media and in other digital networks that use each attack to recruit, to inspire, and we're certainly seeing it now. And I know the ADL and others have done important research on how, in the aftermath of the Capitol attack itself, that became an effective recruiting tool for a number of these other extremist leaders. So it's really important to understand that the way these cycles work, and that no matter the communities that are being specifically targeted in these cases, whether it's the Jewish community, the Muslim community, the Black community, the Latinx community, the Asian community, whether it be through these specific acts of terror or the overall rise in hate crimes and violent extremism we're seeing in this country, we need to understand how deeply our fates are intertwined because of the ways these attacks inspire the next one. And to sort of go back to what we all spoke to earlier, the ways in which the ideology that motivates so many of these attacks really reflects their hatred and their disdain for everyone who doesn't fit into their vile and narrow definition for what this country should be.
Thank you. I mean, listening to this, I'm reminded a few years ago, we had a session at the JCPA plenum in Washington where it was a packed room and a question was asked: how many of you people have members of their own family who are people of color? And a huge number, probably half the room in this particular session, a huge part of the session, and my hand went up there too. Our grandchildren, our mother is Asian, and so our grandchildren identify very much as Asian Americans. And I'm listening to all of this, and I know how here in my own community here in Bethesda, Maryland, we just had a couple of anti-Asian incidents, which just surprised me to greatly. So how do we hold these people to account? What do we do? And I'm going to start with Amy because I know your case is first, but then also Jamal would love to hear about your case and the historic significance of the cases that have come most recently. Amy, if you could start a little bit and explain, and it's also the pathway from Charlottesville to the insurrection. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think it's an accident that both my organization, IFA, and the NAACP have brought lawsuits under a statute called the Ku Klux Klan Act, which this past week marked the 150th anniversary of President Grant signing that statute into law. And the fact that it's newly relevant in 2021 is really a sad testament to the alarming rise in violent extremism and white supremacy in this country. But it also is, I think, an important reminder that we have tools to fight back, that we are not powerless. And accountability matters. We have seen very clearly that accountability can have very real impacts on deterring extremists, on bankrupting them, and dismantling these groups, and that's exactly what we aim to do with our Charlottesville lawsuit. We are suing the 24 individuals and hate groups directly responsible for orchestrating the violence in Unite the Right. In their online chats beforehand, they discussed so many details in advance, down to whether they could hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense, which is, of course, exactly what they did. And so on behalf of 9 Charlottesville community members who were injured in that violence, we are suing those most directly responsible for that racist, violent conspiracy under the KKK Act and other state and federal laws. We are going to trial this October, which will, I think, be quite powerful. And I think the theory of change here is a simple one. First and foremost, it's about accountability and justice at a time when that has been so sorely lacking, winning justice for our plaintiffs, for the Charlottesville community that has seen so little justice in the aftermath of a racist, violent attack on their community. And it's about accountability against the leaders of this movement who orchestrated that violence and who, of course, given the DOJ we had at the time, also did not see any real accountability for their racist violence. But we also know cases like this can have major operational and financial impacts. They can truly bankrupt and dismantle and disrupt these groups in ways. There's a strong history of them going back to the 80s and 90s, some of the cases brought by the SPLC. We've already seen it at our case with defendants like Richard Spencer complaining that the case has been, quote, financially crippling. And when we go to trial this October and win large financial judgments against these defendants, we can truly bankrupt disrupt and dismantle these groups. And of course, there's the trial itself. When we have a 4-week jury trial in Charlottesville, blocks away from Heather Heyer Way, that will be a critical, important moment where we not just sort of lay bare the hate and the extremism and the violence that's at the core of how these individuals and groups operate, but hopefully continue to drive a broader public reckoning on the crisis of violent extremism, both to serve as a deterrent to those who might get involved, and to help wake the country up to this crisis.
Great. Jamal, let's hear about your case as well.
Amy framed out, when you think about the use of the Ku Klux Klan Act in modern times, literally this year, being used as a framework for holding now our former president accountable, it's actually sad that it's come to that. Because what we're realizing is that patterns of racism used to exert political violence, used to control, in this case, the actions and work of our Congress, the U.S. Congress, was literally being flamed and pushed by a current sitting president, if you will, who is transitioning clearly out of power. And so the lawsuit for us was a signal in that you have to be held personally accountable for your actions, and the rule of law applies to everyone, no matter what position you have held or currently held. With this intersection of race and class and xenophobia with politics, it's a clear example of, those that are in power actually manipulating and using, in our opinion, individuals from all walks of life and actually flaming and inflaming them to do something illegal. But you didn't see Donald Trump climbing the walls. You didn't see him storming the Capitol, or his children, or his political friends who are the billionaires and millionaires that support him. You saw the others being really whipped into a frenzy to do their bidding. And so part of our accountability metric is looking at it through the lens of the courts, but also would flag that, part of the struggle, when you think about that intersection of politics, racism, xenophobia, hate, if you will, is that conservatives have packed the courts with judges that have been unqualified or not qualified according to certain standards, because they understand the courts is a form of remedy. It's where we have found relief, if you will, against racism and other policies that are ridiculously structured to perpetuate what we've seen in terms of oppression. And so, part of our strategy is multifaceted. It's the lawsuit piece in terms of litigation. There's also the push to diversify the courts under the current administration. Like the DC Circuit is open. Merrick Garland is now Attorney General. And so whoever replaces Merrick Garland is going to be key for that placement in the courts. The Seventh Circuit is vacant. That's a position in the courts that matters. And so while we're litigating, we're also looking at who's on the bench and what does that look like as we turn a corner out of Trump and the Trumpism and the Trump administration plus McConnell push to really pack the courts. And I should say this, at NAACP, we're C3 and C4, we're nonpartisan, but we're not blind. And so the last thing I would add to this configuration is that politicians who are a part of and responsible for what happened on January 6th, we're actually working with the ADL to launch a new campaign, similar to the campaign we had on stopping hate for profit, which is the whole online algorithm Facebook fight that we're still in. We're actually looking at corporations who fund politicians that promote political violence as a form of protest, that actually pass legislation like voter suppression laws, anti-protest laws, and we question those companies to stop giving to these individuals and to use their platform through corporate responsibility and accountability as a voice. So, we have to manage the notion of litigation, thinking about who sits on the bench in the courts, and then holding the funders of these bad actors accountable so that the continuum of hate, if you will, is completely disrupted.
I mean, you mentioned did you have something to add, Oren? You mentioned the Biden administration, and so the question then is, are you already seeing things? What should we expect? This isn't going to be easy by any stretch, but are there specific tools and resources to hold these groups accountable that beyond the lawsuits that are pending right now? Could you talk a little bit more about that? And Amy and Oren, please jump in.
I would say, and I feel like we're in the early stages of what is climbing us out of a dark period over the last 4 years plus of the Trump administration. And so when I think about our work with the new administration and the push for making racial equity real, the racial equity executive order was a signal that, the administration plus agencies are working to turn a corner across all levels around racial equity. And I know that sounds very theoretical and wonky, but it's the notion that in everything that is happening on the side of government, not just with the Department of Justice, but say trade and interior and housing, that racial equity data and metrics have to be used to close disparity gaps. Now, this doesn't stop people from being bad actors. It doesn't stop folks from having hate and being perpetuators of hate and violence. But what it does signal is that in our institutions and our systems, we will use everything we can to eliminate racial inequities and disparities across the board. So that's one signal that I think is very powerful. And we're proud of the work with Ambassador Susan Rice, who now heads up the Domestic Policy Council, to really start to churn and unpack what does it mean to dig deeper so that we're not just dealing with how people think and feel, but their lived experiences. So, for example, when it comes to all of the money that's going to be spent on infrastructure or the American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion of that plan, how does it actually go to women of color, racial and ethnic minority businesses, which have been decimated under COVID? Now, you may think, oh, that doesn't matter, that doesn't get to the heart of racism, but it does, because if you can address class and systems and structures of racial inequities, then what you're doing is you're right-sizing the ship so that when we're dealing with the hearts and minds of men, we're not dealing with a complete crisis from A to Z. And so I would argue that's a step in the right direction, but we in civil society have to push, and fight to make that real, because it's going to take us years, if not decades, to turn a corner.
Yeah, I just want to agree with Jamal and say, in terms of the whole of society approach, is just that's going to be required for a long time to come. So it's not just all of government, but all of society. And so beyond, the some of the work that Jamal also mentioned in terms of stop hate for profit and holding companies accountable, not just to their bottom line, but to the better judgment of how to prevent extremists from exploiting their services. We at ADL have put together a general plan. It's called the Protect Plan, that identifies a couple of key areas that we do think this government now is ready to and must consider in terms of mitigating the threat of right-wing extremists, which is one of the reasons we're on this call. And so I'm not going to go through all 7, but I will just note that prioritizing the prevention of countering domestic terrorism. Part of that is literally just being able to resource to the threats. So much of the efforts that were created prior to the last administration were decimated. And so it's just sort of resourcing and providing opportunities to say, how do we measure through the government what the actual level of domestic terrorism is? And that's supporting policies like the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, where we've seen some progress on there. Hate crime laws increasingly, making more communities report, law enforcement agencies report hate crime laws. We're also focusing on opposing extremists in government service. Right? I think a lot has been discussed, even post-insurrection, about law enforcement and military and other institutions that really require extra scrutiny, because even 1 or 2 extremists is a huge problem. So doubling down on finding ways to make sure that no extremist ever finds themselves in government service. And then, just to note that having the complicity of social media in allowing extremism on their platforms may require some regulation, right? And so we don't need to get into that whole discussion now, but that's another way we can, I think, start considering ways that we can, have the government become part of a solution and not just part of a problem, which seemed to be the status quo over the past couple of years.
I definitely agree. with Jamal and Oren, and I think, litigation is important, but it's not a silver bullet, and we need this not just to reiterate not just this whole government, but whole of society approach. I also think, though, to your question of what we can expect from the Biden administration, personnel is policy, and the Biden administration has made some really important appointments, including and especially at the Department of Justice. We already talked about Merrick Garland. Vanita Gupta was finally confirmed last week, and we are waiting for Kristen Clark to be confirmed to lead the Civil Rights Division. Kristen Clark is a former colleague of mine from the New York AG's office. She has done important work at the Lawyers Committee, including specifically taking on some of the very violent extremists that we're talking about here, like Andrew Anglin, who's also a defendant in our lawsuit, and runs the neo-Nazi site, the Daily Stormer. And so we need the Senate to confirm Kristen. I know the JCPA and others have been outspoken about some of the sneers thrown at her. And make no mistake, the fact that these incredibly accomplished women of color are being targeted by the right here is precisely because there are some on the right who are afraid of what they will do to move the ball forward on civil rights and justice after 4 years of the Trump administration gutting civil rights at the Department of Justice. And so it's really crucial that these personnel appointments actually move forward, because again, personnel is policy, and having the right people in these roles to ensure civil rights are being effectively protected and DOJ is living up to its mission is so key.
Listening to you all, I'm also struck. One of the things that I've noticed in the last 2 months from the Biden administration is that the Office of Faith and Community Engagement has really stepped up its game even from the Obama administration too, as far as I'm concerned. And basically, by bringing the faith community together, be it for making sure you have COVID testing out there into the community, making sure that people see values and the importance of values in governing, has been, I think, very I found it very welcoming, and I would urge particularly the professionals in this who are here at the workshop to make sure you get on their list, because they have programs every week that might be very helpful for you in your local communities in building coalitions. Because this building a coalition that really it sounds like is going to make a huge difference in this fight. It really sounds to me, listening to all of you, it's there is this about fighting against white supremacy and right-wing extremism is really connected to the larger fight for racial justice. And right now, one way we're also seeing how voter suppression laws impact a lot of what's going on in the conversation about what I think Jamal actually talked to, about the worry about who gets elected and what happens. Could you talk a little bit about how all of this is really one gigantic fight for equity and things that are just so natural to the people who are participating in a JCPA conference, but aren't so naturally understood to many others?
Yeah, Susan, I would go back to this notion that, in many ways, elections, especially during a presidential cycle, really, I think, rips the Band-Aid off of how racialized our nation has become in terms of how we view one another and in communities. And the outcome of this past election, if you look at even the news cycle, there was story after story of voters in, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Black voters turning the tide. Even in the primaries, Joe Biden's rise in South Carolina was put on this notion that it was Black voters that turned the tide. you can only assume that folks who don't like Black people are pretty upset by that narrative and that notion, even though when you think about elections, African Americans aren't the majority of voters in this country. And so the reason why I lift that up is because when you're talking about the debate and the narrative, what we see in many ways around this country is that, you know, if you have a bully pulpit, say you're the president of the United States, if you start demonizing the AAPI community, the Asian American Pacific Islander community, folks who don't know better or who are looking for something to latch onto use that as their marching orders, as their, not even a dog whistle at this point, as their express marching orders. And so in this current moment, we've seen this year that 33 states literally, you know, in February had filed, I think, over 165 restricted voting bills in 2021. If you compare that to 2020, February of 2020, there were only 35 such bills in 15 states. And it's because the narrative has been whipped up to say something's broken and it's racialized and the other is actually taking away your political freedoms and your rights. And even when you connect it to, you know, at the state level, we've seen lawmakers in Oklahoma and Iowa passing bills granting immunity to drivers whose vehicles strike and injure protesters in public streets. We didn't see a rash of laws actually punishing individuals for doing that after Charlottesville. So in some ways, when you talk about this notion of voting, laws, political will, it's all, I think, an ecosystem that is being used, and race is actually the thing that whips folks to the left or the right of what is right. And I believe, you know, when you think about the work of, say, Oren and ADL and NAACP and organizations like ours, our goal is to make sure that we're taking a look at not only the legal infrastructure, but also who's behind it and what are the intentionalities behind it. Because 9 times out of 10, it's usually someone that's trying to stay in power and that's trying to hold on to power and is willing to do whatever to demonize others. And so in many ways, I think what we're wrestling with, focused on this because of the nature of our organization, is how do we actually make sure that the law and the rules are unrigged so that racialized outcomes aren't the norm, and so that we actually are dealing with who we are as a community and as a country, as opposed to, you know, these arbitrary laws that pretty much are intended to do racialized harm.
Wow. You know, in our community, in the Jewish community, we've heard a lot lately also about how people arguing that anti-Semitism as part of this whole hate universe comes from both the left and the right, and that we need to be equally worried about both. That's been out there. I'm curious to know what the facts are telling us. Oren?
So I'm going to be honest, and I think that that's a question that is completely understandable, but ultimately one that doesn't really move the needle. Anti-Semitism is not a left-wing issue. It's not a right-wing issue. And nobody should care about anti-Semitism because it's emanating from the left or the right or from under a rock. People should care about anti-Semitism and racism and other forms of bigotry because that's what we ought to do. And frankly, I think sometimes the discussions about whether it's coming from the left or the right distracts people from the common cause we actually all have, no matter what part of the political spectrum we're on. So let's just all agree that anti-Semitism is a problem, period, and then try to find ways to deal with that. And I think actually, this is one of the reasons I've been at ADL for so long, is when you look at our mission, right, it's not only to stop the defamation of the Jewish people, but secure justice for all. So there's a recognition that in order to fight anti-Semitism, you do fight for racial justice. You do fight against Islamophobia and anti-LGBT bigotry and anti-Asian bigotry. And the way that you fight against those hatreds is fighting against anti-Semitism. I think that's what we should focus on.
I appreciate that. And it's sort of interesting because listening to you, I have heard, obviously, Karen Dunn and Robbie Kaplan talk with Amy, speak with her, and they're often asked, what surprises you? And I think Amy knows can speak to this, which is the answer that Robbie usually says is how, regardless of what when they look at these issues, what they find is the virulent hatred of Jews, that sort of has been something that actually surprised the lawyers in the Charlottesville case. Amy, can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And I think, and I wholeheartedly agree with Oren that this anti-Semitism in some ways has been politicized, and that only is a detriment to us who are actively at risk alongside so many other communities by the rise in violent extremism fueled by this hate. To your point, I think what has surprised so many of us, and I think, Robbie Kaplan, one of our lead attorneys, talks about how she's a famous lawyer and a New Yorker and a lesbian and won marriage equality at the Supreme Court. But the thing that these extremists focus on when they target us here is her Judaism, my Judaism, and it manifests in sort of threats and cartoons that literally look like they came out of Nazi Germany. And obviously I know Eric Ward is speaking, I think, on a parallel session, and he has written extensively about how anti-Semitism really is the central motivating factor in white nationalism and white supremacy. And it's so important to recognize that, to be clear-eyed about that, because what that tells us is that our fates are so deeply intertwined as communities. You can't take on white supremacy without taking on anti-Semitism, and you can't take on anti-Semitism without taking on white supremacy, racism, Islamophobia, and so many of the other forms of hate that we've been here talking about. Our fates are too deeply intertwined. I also think we need to be clear-eyed without politicizing it, clear-eyed about where the threats are coming from. And that's important for us as a community to do. Oren talked already about the ADL's report about extremist murders. We know that we are facing a crisis of extremism, far-right extremism in this country. And every report, every statistic that comes out, not just from NGOs and nonprofits, but from the federal government itself, underscores the urgency of this crisis, not just for the Jewish community, but for so many other communities. The Department of Homeland Security called white supremacists the most persistent and lethal threat to this country. We can go on and on and on about the ways in which we as a Jewish community are at risk because of far-right extremism and white supremacy right now, which isn't to say that there isn't anti-Semitism in other forms. But the gravest threat to our communities right now are coming from these ideologies that we've been talking about. And just the other week, a study came out from a professor at Tufts and a professor at Harvard that found that the young right-wing individuals are really sort of the epicenter of anti-Semitic ideology and misconceptions at this moment. I would definitely encourage people to take a look at that study. It's Professor Eitan Hirsch at Tufts who published it, I believe, last week. And so I think we need to, as Oren said, not politicize this, because that is how we so often end up in situations like the one we're in, where anti-Semitism has become a political football, but at the same time also be very clear-eyed about where the threats are coming from and how they continue to grow and evolve, as we've been talking about here, and that means being clear-eyed about the facts.
Thank you. We only have a few short minutes left, but I think this is a workshop. So the question that I have for all three of you is, okay, what can we do? What can we as individuals do? What can we as institutions do? What can we as nonprofits do to fight these violent movements and protect our democracy? I just spent a couple days with our grandchildren and across the country, and all of us have had such a horrific year, and all of us have been watching this darkness in the background of everything. And what can we do? How can we make it better? The floor is open.
I'm happy to start, and I'll be super quick. I think there's a couple of just very practical elements. One is, when you see something in your neighborhood, report it, whether it's reporting it to law enforcement, whether it's reporting it to ADL. Data is critical. That's what you use to resource to a threat. That's what you use in your advocacy to convince policymakers and others to do something about these threats. So report in the various ways that you can do that. 2, use your voice, speak up. When you see something, you say something like somebody tells me in New York, but you can also, when you see something negative, you can use positivity as a response. You can call out bad. One of the concerns that I have is people don't even recognize hate anymore. And so we need to constantly remind people sunlight really is the best disinfectant. The 3rd, be an ally. When you see something happen to another community, treat it as if it's happening to your own. Those people will be there for you later. And actually, again, that's the way that we combat hate. I have 2 more quick ones. When you have an opportunity to hear Spitalnick, Jamal Watkins, go listen to them. And then 5th, plant a tree somewhere.
Thanks, Oren. Amy? Or go ahead, Jamal. Go ahead, Jamal.
I would say, echoing everything that Oren lifted up, but one of the things that I would, even emphasize more, besides in your local community, if you see something, say something, counter misinformation and disinformation on every single platform you have access to. So if you see something circulating on the web, the internet, whether you're on Facebook, Instagram, or whatever, Twitter, put messages out there and narratives out there that are the right messages, the right narratives. And for those of you that have infrastructure and organization and entity, a leadership role, education and awareness matters. So this type of digital session can be replicated in your local community with having a similar conversation, because 9 times out of 10, folks do not know what they don't know. And so how do you continue to promote education and awareness? And then, we are linked to this notion that we all are connected to the political infrastructure. So how do we hold politicians and leaders accountable, but also push for laws and policies that are going to make life better for the communities we serve? And so when you see, voter suppression laws or laws around anti-protest, what is the countermeasures that should be passed? What is the counter efforts that should be pushed? And as voters, really pushing on that, because we can change structures and institutions through both policy advocacy and accountability. But I would, say at the end of the day, as individuals, if we do our part to really counter misinformation and disinformation, I believe that goes a long way, because in many ways, what folks are hearing and seeing is coming from their communities, their neighbors, folks that they follow online. And if we're the echo chamber for what is right and what makes sense, hopefully we can counter a lot of the messages out there that are recruiting folks into the hate continuum.
Thank you. Amy?
I, of course, wholeheartedly agree with everything that's been said, and would add that in addition to coming to hear Jamal and his colleagues at the NAACP or getting involved with IFA as well, goes into Oren and his incredibly brilliant colleagues at the ADL, who put out report after report, lays this all out in such clear and important ways. And that, I think, particularly for those who are professionals in their community, arms you with the tools you need to actually talk about the realities we're facing as a community, and again, how our fate is so interconnected with so many other communities with whom I suspect you work. And so I would definitely encourage that. Look, I think it's so easy to feel powerless and helpless in this moment. It's scary for reasons, and even though it seems like the tide is with the new administration in Washington, the Biden administration doesn't mean the threat of violent extremism has gone away, and in some ways it's actually gotten worse. And we can't become complacent. We need to make sure that when something like the Capitol attack moves out of the still hold people's feet to the fire about the urgency of this crisis. And so that means, of course, the case we're bringing, the case the NAACP is bringing, and of course the governmental action that we're finally seeing from DOJ as it relates to the Capitol, making sure that our officials, not just on the federal level, but on the state and local level, are being held accountable to their responsibilities to prosecute hate crimes, to root out hate in their communities, and of course, as has been mentioned here, making sure the private sector, including tech companies, are being held accountable, which include regulation, which is now being discussed in a real way in Washington. And so making sure that when the news moves on, we do not move on. We continue holding people accountable, responsibility to treat this with the urgency it deserves.
Thank you. Thank you all. And thanks everyone for sticking in with us. We started this session, and I think you all should know there were 74 people. And when I started talking a minute ago, right now there are 73. That's really pretty remarkable that this issue was so interesting to so many people, and that what you have been able to tell all of us was useful, pragmatic, and honest, and straightforward, and that together we can make a difference. 2 years ago, I walked away from this panel and said, I want to get involved, and I hope everyone, all 72 of you who are still here, will think about how can you get involved, what can you do, reaching out to the NAACP, to ADL, to IFA, and to JCPA, and working with with all of us to make a difference, and to make sure that 2 years from now we have a better story to begin to tell. So thank you all for being part of this. And thanks to our wonderful panel.